Configuration files for .NET are hierarchical, meaning the configuration for your application is controlled not only by the web.config in your project, but also by configuration files at a higher level. When you're running the MVC application, the configuration starts with a machine-level configuration file. That file controls basic settings for all .NET 4.0 applications that run on the same computer. We'll take a look at where this file lives and what's inside in just a minute. There's also a machine-level web.config file that puts in place all the default settings for every ASP.NET application on a machine. And before we get to the web.config file that's in our application, we might also have a parent web.config file that we inherit settings from, and that would happen if our application is deployed underneath another ASP.NET web application. So configuration settings are inherited downwards, and the configuration in effect when you run an application is the combination of all these config files. Inside the web.config file for my application, I can generally override any settings that might be in place from the machine-level config or the machine-level web.config file, although administrators do have the capability of locking down settings and preventing me from overriding a value. Let's take a look at what these configuration files look like. I'm going to use Windows Explorer to navigate to the C Windows Microsoft.NET Framework directory. Inside of this directory, you'll see subdirectories that have version numbers, and these version numbers correspond to different versions of the CLR that's installed. Since we're running with MVC 3 and Visual Studio 2010, we're running on .NET 4.0, so I'm going to look inside of that directory, and here is a config directory that has all of the master configuration files, including the machine.configuration file. Again, this file is the master configuration file. It puts together all of the default settings for every .NET application that runs on the machine, not just web applications, but desktop applications and Windows services too. This is mostly filled with configuration sections, which tell .NET what type do I load to read a particular configuration section that I come across inside of the XML. And once you get through the configuration sections, you can see some of the default settings that are in place. For instance, here's a default connection string that's available to any application called Local SQL Server. By default, it uses a SQL Express database. Here are some default settings for Windows Communication Foundation. And here's some system.web settings. So by default, we'll have an ASP.NET membership provider configured. We actually reconfigured that provider inside of our own web.config because we wanted to change the connection string name that it is using. You might remember that from the security module. We also reconfigured the default ASP.NET SQL profile provider. So when we're running an MVC application, all of these settings are in play. We also pick up settings from a web.config file that is in this folder. Let's just open that up once. And you can see there's some security policy configuration. This is also where we have compilers configured. Down here is the default authorization rule, which is to allow all users into an application. And if we go a little further down, we can find the default health monitoring configuration sections, the default HTTP handlers that respond to requests for specific file types like .aspx or .ascx. Here are the modules that are inside of the ASP.NET pipeline, and so forth. So we have all of those settings in effect when our application runs. Eventually, the settings that are inside of our own web.config file are also applied. And these web.config settings can override things like the provider for SQL membership. This is where we changed, basically we wanted to change the connection string name to point to application services and also reconfigure some of the defaults for the password strength. And then even inside of our own application, there is hierarchical configuration. So if you place a web.config file in a subfolder in an application, it can override settings that are specific to that folder. So inside of the views folder, you're going to find a web.config file. And let's open that up once. Inside of here is where the Razor configuration is stored. In an earlier module in this course, we came in and modified this file to add a new namespace and make that namespace available when ASP.NET was parsing and compiling Razor code. But there are some other interesting pieces in here too. You'll notice that here is an HTTP handler section. Basically, this is saying that if there's any request that arrives directly into the views folder, turn it over to this HTTP handler called the HTTP not found handler. That particular handler just basically returns an HTTP 404 not found for any request. Why do we do that? Because we really don't want anyone using a browser to directly request a view that's inside of here, directly request a CSHTML file. The only way that we should be rendering one of those CSHTML files is by producing a view result or a partial view result from a controller. So the request has to go through a controller in order to view one of these views. By default, you'll have this web.config file in your views folder so that if someone does directly request a view, they'll just have a 404 error.